Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to our East Coast families. Welcome to our Winward Academy presentation on ACT versus SAT, how to decide which tests to take. I'm Dr. Jennifer Winward, the founder and CEO of Winward Academy, and I'm really excited to go through this presentation with you today. So let's go ahead and get started because we have lots to cover. So here's our agenda for today. So the initial question is that big question that every family always wants to know is how do you pick between ACT and SAT? So what I'm going to do is go through kind of the steps that different families take to identify which test is better for their teens and illustrate the 5 behaviors that are critically important for teens to do as they're making this decision between the 2 tests. Then, backed by popular demand, to provide some pie charts to you that actually break down how frequently various concepts are tested on the ACT and on the SAT. So that'll be kind of the second part of today's presentation. And then lastly, we'll end with giving you some tips for success for both exams. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with how to pick between the ACT and SAT. Now, these are the questions that I always get from parents, right? ACT or SAT, how do we choose which one's best? When should we take the first real test? How do you even prepare? When do you start? What do we do first? So the goal of today's presentation is to address these questions, which again are the most burning questions that we get from families. Now, the way that we answer these questions for families is basically by responding to all these questions with, well, has your child taken a full-length practice ACT and a full-length practice SAT so that we can compare baseline scores and help identify which test is stronger for the student? Now, why is this important? Why is it so critical to kind of start with these baseline exams? Well, when I have a family who calls me and says, well, you know, my son got a 23 or my daughter got a 24, you know, for the first time taking the test, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? I need to know exactly what questions the student missed. I need to know in the questions that the student missed, what were the wrong answers that the student put so that we can identify if there are any patterns to the mistakes that the student is making, right? So taking this initial step of doing a practice test is so critical. Yes, to help you identify which test is stronger, but also to help you develop a timeline and a plan that's been informed by data, right, and experience of a student so that you can really maximize the preparation process. Now, one really quick note for all of the families is that please, please, please be extra careful that when you take this practice ACT or when you take this practice SAT, make sure that it is a real past exam. So not a made-up test by a prep company, right? A lot of companies have an incredibly unscrupulous practice where they make up their own practice tests and then they make the diagnostic artificially harder so that scores look lower. They make the exit exam artificially easier so that it looks like students grew possibly more than they did. It's unconscionable, to be completely honest. You need to be very, very careful when you're choosing your resources to make sure that you are, that your kids are only interacting with past real ACTs and past real SATs that have been distributed by those companies or by those nonprofits, technically. Okay, why else is it important to do a practice test? Well, remember that doing well on an ACT or SAT is not just about the content knowledge. Yes, that's probably 80% of it, right? If you see a question about the area of a trapezoid, you need to know the area, or excuse me, you need to know the equation for area of a trapezoid. So yes, content knowledge is incredibly important in doing well. That being said, there are other factors too, and so experiencing these other factors is also really important to guarantee student success. So first, making sure that they're prepared, right? That they know to have their pencils, that they know to bring their calculator. Also with the calculator, that the calculator is charged. You don't want to turn on your calculator when your real test starts and have it say low battery. That being said, if it happens to you on a practice test, that's a good thing because then it will be, again, be a good cue for you to make sure that you don't make that same mistake on the test. Another thing too about calculators, make sure that they are in degree mode. I had a student once, probably 12 years ago, he called me after his ACT and he's like, every single SOHCAHTOA problem, I don't understand. I couldn't find the answer. What I was calculating wasn't an answer choice. Well, his calculator had been in radian mode the entire time instead of degree mode the entire time. So again, these are the types of things that students need to experience during practice settings so that they can make sure that on the real test day, they know what to expect and they've anticipated these issues. Also really important is just practicing the stamina piece. It is hard for students to stay focused for 4 hours straight for an exam with one 10-minute break in the middle. So part of getting ready for test day is anticipating what that experience is like and how important it is to get that 10-minute break and learn what works best for you to maximize your ability to recharge and get that energy back and have a snack or chew on an Altoid if that mint helps to wake up your brain, right? Whatever it is that you need to do, you have to experience it. So then when you're doing the test, it's not your first rodeo, right? It's not your first time experiencing those different factors. Also keep in mind too, I tell my students this all the time, your score is as much determined by your accuracy in the first bubble in the first section as it is in the last bubble in the last section, which means that, again, part of doing well is that you can remain consistent throughout the entire test, where you can really focus your attention, make sure that you're incredibly tuned in so that you're really, really as sharp as possible throughout the exam. Also important to just practice what it's like doing a test for this long when there are potential distractions. Right now, given our current situation, right, the biggest distraction a student could use to practice with is to wear a mask, right? Some people have said that if you know that you're going to have to wear a mask for the 4-hour exam, you might as well wear it while you're doing the practice, again, just so that you can get used to some of those factors that are going to be outside your control. Keep in mind too that when you're taking the real test, there's going to be the person sniffling, there's going to be the person shaking his leg, there's going to be the person tapping the pencil, right? Those types of things are going to happen in the real test, which again is why it's just good to do practice so then you get used to those types of situations. Time management is also a huge piece of being successful on these exams. Students do not truly understand what the pacing is like and what the time management is like until they can experience those factors in a timed practice exam. So again, kind of the idea of these practice opportunities is that it's this risk-free chance to experience how long is each section, how many questions are in each section, what are the types of questions that you see, what are the patterns that emerge in the answer choices. You've got to get exposed to all of that so that you know what to expect when it comes time for the real exam. The other part too that's critically important is that students practice when they're doing time practice, they're also practicing their bubbling. So one thing that students sometimes do, which they should not do, is they administer a time practice, but they're only marking in their booklet. They're not also bubbling the Scantron as part of that timed session. That's not going to give you an accurate sense of how you're going to do on the real test, because on the real test, you do have to bubble the Scantron. And that takes time, usually about 1 to 1.5 minutes, right? By the time you've kind of have finished filling in all the bubbles. And it's an easy place to make mistakes. I can't tell you how many times I've had a student where the booklet has a C circled and then the Scantron has a B bubbled. Well, guess what? If the answer was C and you got it right in your booklet, if you didn't bubble it correctly on the Scantron, it's not going to count. So again, practice experiences are so important for students because they get to recognize, wow, do I make that mistake? Do I sometimes bubble the wrong letter? Okay, I need to really practice that. I need to be really attentive to that. So again, we're just trying to create these opportunities for students to learn more about themselves, to learn more about the exams, to learn more about how they need to control their focus and their attention throughout that entire practice. And really the ultimate goal of all of what I'm describing to you is that we're turning the unknown into something that feels like second nature, right? Something that feels like a routine. So how do we do that, right? The goal is we need to first identify what are the content gaps. What are the things that students don't remember from elementary or middle school? Or what are the things that they don't remember from their freshman year geometry class? Right? Part of the issue of doing well on these exams is that you have to remember a lot of what you've learned throughout middle school and high school. So addressing those content gaps, knowing how to fill them in, that's how students end up showing up to the real test, feeling like it's second nature. Also keep in mind too that just confidence and being calm and feeling in control of the environment and your experience, all of that contributes to students doing better. So part of why practice tests are such an essential part of answering this big ACT versus SAT question is so that we can get students to this point in which they feel calm, they feel confident, they feel in control. Also really important is that we're helping students build their skills and their content knowledge for beyond an ACT or SAT, right? So what they have to learn as they're reviewing for these exams are basic grammar rules with parallel structure and pronouns and agreement and apostrophes. They have to review math equations that maybe go back to middle school to make sure that they're sharp with their problem solving. And they need to be strong readers. All of that is just critical for life, right? So if they're putting in this time to address these content gaps, I think sometimes if you take a step back and can kind of embrace that process is something that's really going to be good long-term, right? It's not just limited to something that you do for 4 hours when you're 17 years old. There's a much bigger, longer-term impact of just solidifying and building these skills. And part of that is that, of course, you also become more confident. And as you become more confident, you're more familiar, you kind of build your endurance, you also have less anxiety, right? And anxiety is huge right now. Anxiety is always huge for these exams. But when you add everything going on right now and how many teens and young people are more anxious, how many of their parents are more anxious, right? There is a lot of that going on that already happens for these tests. So as much as possible, whatever we can do to address that anxiety, to assuage that anxiety, that's what we really need to focus on. The other thing too that I know I mentioned a little bit earlier, right? Someone just telling me, oh, I got a 26. Okay, right? Just knowing a number, just knowing a score is not enough. The only way that your students will see meaningful growth is when they dig into that 26, right? They look at every single question, they understand their mistakes, they paraphrase what they learn into their own words. They go back, they redo questions that they missed previously, right? Those are the behaviors, those are the steps, those are the study skills that are so critical to be able to see that huge growth on these exams that so many students are looking for. So what I want to do now is show you what are those 5 steps that every student has to take to, again, embrace the value of this practice test experience beyond a score. Now, whether you're working with a private tutor, whether you're working independently with a book, whether you're using Winward Academy, what I want to do again is focus on the behaviors that are critical to do, again, whether you're working independently or whether you have support. To illustrate these behaviors, I'm going to use our platform because, of course, that's what I have access to. But again, what I want you to focus on are what are the behaviors that I'm emphasizing that are so critical for students to do. So behavior number 1, after doing a practice test, this is a practice ACT, this is a practice SAT, this is maybe when you're still trying to figure out which test is better for you, these 5 steps are critical. Number 1, you need to look at your mistakes, focusing on them by lesson or by topic so that you can really zone in on, you can really address those content gaps. So what does that look like? So once you have your Scantron, you have your score report, you've kind of entered your answers, and you're kind of looking at your accuracy. What you should do is find a way to sort all of the questions in a section. So this example here is an English section with a Scantron for a student. Sort that by lesson. So then when you're accessing the explanations, and again, you can do this working with a tutor, you can do this on your own through various platforms, you can also do this on your own, working with a book. But the idea is that when you can chunk what you have missed so that you're doing the explanations together, Chunking is a huge benefit for students' long-term learning. So instead, I'm going to go back here for a second, of going over question 7 and then 10 and then 11, right? Instead of reviewing my mistakes in chronological order, when I can sort them and I can chunk them by what was tested, now I can do 4 explanations just for basics but essentials. I can do 4 explanations just for pronouns. Now what's happening is, as a student, I'm really zoning in on the content area that I need. And when you get that repetition of multiple examples, again, it just helps you to see how they test that content. And it really helps you to solidify your knowledge with that skill. All right, number 2, for every student, that is a must do. You have to be able to get step-by-step explanations for any question you miss. Why is that important? Number 1, it's important because you have to understand the wrong answer. You have to understand not only why the right answer is right, but also why the incorrect answer that you put is incorrect. Just knowing why the right answer is right is not enough. You have to go through that extra step of also understanding why your answer choice was incorrect. Did they try to trick you? Was there a strategy that you need? Did you make a silly mistake, like you forgot to distribute a negative sign? Whatever it was, you have to dig into that. That's part 1. Part 2 is, after you have learned from your mistake, you have to now paraphrase. You have to put what you learn into your own words. So what does that look like? So let's pretend I'm accessing an explanation for question number 7, for this question that I missed. Again, I'm having someone or some platform explain to me, here's why the right answer is right, here's why each incorrect answer was incorrect, here's the strategy, here's what's being tested. So the idea is, I didn't know something about question number 7 when I missed it. Now with an explanation, I understand what I missed, I understand how they were trying to trick me. So the next step, which again is so critical, and students can do this on their own as well, is to find a way to now put what you learn into your own words. So what I'm going to show you here is this hint feature. So basically we encourage students, give yourself a hint for this question, and then generate a customized, personalized study guide that's going to organize all of the hints that you've written to yourself for every lesson, for every topic, for every practice test. So again, a platform can organize this for you, or of course, if you're working independently, you can keep this structured with your handwritten notes. All right, what is the third step? The third step is to make sure that for every single mistake that you make on a practice test, that you go through 3 steps after you have reviewed the explanation. Number 1, for every question, you have to make sure that after you've watched that explanation, that you can put what is the question asking into your own words, that you can solve it correctly, right? So the thought is that step-by-step explanation helps you with these first 2 steps. What is the question asking you to do, and how do you solve it? The third step is the most important step, and that's that step 2 that's going to guide what is the hint that you write to yourself for the question. What would you put in your study guide? You have to think to yourself, why did you miss this? Picture the sentence. I missed this question because, fill in the blank. I missed this question because I didn't know that who goes with he and whom goes with him. I missed this question because I didn't know the equation for volume of a cylinder. Whatever it is, you answer that question for yourself. You have to go through that step to identify, because if you don't, you're going to miss out on an opportunity to really solidify your knowledge with how to get the most out of this practice experience. Again, as I already mentioned, right, you're going to put 4 hours into doing a practice test, and that's a lot, and you're going to be tired, right? Students with extra time, they're going to put in 6 hours. That being said, the more important 4 hours or the more important 6 hours, that's the time that you actually put into going over every single question you missed, going through all of these steps to make sure that you're really learning from your mistakes and that you're really able to grow in your content knowledge and your confidence. Step 4. Make sure that, again, you're either getting support doing this, or you're working with someone who's going to do this, or a student independently can get that support to do this analysis piece. The analysis is critical. Students have to be able to analyze their mistakes. They need to be able to see what was my percentage accuracy broken down by each concept. Otherwise, they don't know what to study, right? So if I tell a student, hey, you really need to go review your, combining fractions. Well, what if the student had 3 questions on combining fractions and got them all right? That's completely irresponsible of me. I am wasting parents' valuable resources. I'm wasting a student's time. Not professional, right? Not acceptable, not okay. If you're going to make a suggestion to a student who is already pressed for time, you need to go put 2 hours of your life each week studying something. You better make sure that those suggestions are informed by data about how that student is doing and what those content area gaps are. So again, make sure that after you have done a practice test that you receive support in this process to then go to an analysis that will break down for you every single section of the test, every single lesson. How many were right? How many were incorrect? How many were blank? This blank column is interesting. People ask me all the time, why do you care telling people how many are blank? I'm going to talk about this at the end with the tips. The reason is that that blank column should have all zeros. On the ACT and SAT, there's no penalty for guessing. So if you run out of time and you have 5 questions left, do not leave them blank. You should just guess the same letter straight down. And again, I'll talk about that more in a little bit. So when you access an analysis like this, why is it important? Why is it, critical that you can look at this type of information to pick ACT or SAT? Well, the reason is that you should sort by accuracy, right? You need to see what are you missing and in what areas. Then you need some way to indicate for yourself, okay, this is what I really need to focus on. Then once you have identified those lessons in which you have lower accuracy, what you can see here is now when students are reviewing their explanations, they can get that visual cue of, hey, this is an explanation you should pay extra close attention to because it's starred, because you didn't have as high of accuracy. Also important with using information from practice tests is that it's going to guide what lessons do you need, what content area gaps do you need to fill. So what's important again is that you can take data from the practice test, pull it into then lessons that you need so that you actually are studying things that you need to study. So the hope here, right, is that that visual indicator or there's some sort of support that you're getting that's telling you, do this lesson, finish this lesson, do these practice questions, learn this content. You have to be able to use that data from the practice test, again, to inform what you need to study. Number 5, after you've done a diagnostic, you've gone through all of this time to review, to learn from your mistakes. Now what you would do is go back to that same test, circle those questions that you missed before, and redo them to make sure that you don't miss them anymore. Only after you feel 100% confident in every mistake that you made on an exam, now you're ready for the next test. Same process. Now you're ready for the next test. And as you're taking multiple tests, you have to be incredibly intentional with, again, the review that you're doing, the data that you're looking at across those exams. So let's pretend I've taken these 3 tests. I took a diagnostic, test 1, and test 2. First thing that's important is that, again, I can track my growth over time. So making sure that you have some sort of way that's supporting you so that you can track visually, how are you doing? Also important, I call this little part at the bottom, the see what you can do section. Basically what it's doing is it's showing students the highest score that they've ever gotten in a section across multiple exams. So it's basically showing a student, this is what you're capable of, which again is just really great for building their confidence. Also important after you've taken multiple exams is to track your accuracy by topic over time. So what that means is that, again, for every single section, for every single lesson, you need to make sure that you can compare, okay, how did I do the first test to the most recent? Or how have I done just on the last 2 tests, like the most recent 2 exams? And then within every single lesson, again, you need to dig into the topic of where have I shown growth and where have I not shown growth. Because if you have taken multiple exams and you've been really diligent about this review experience in between each one, If you are still making mistakes on that most recent test, there's a reason, and that's what you need to zone in on. So having access to these types of breakdowns that, again, will give you those growth indicators. Are you growing? Are you staying the same? Are you decreasing? You have to be able to really dig into this information so that, again, the time that you're putting into studying is going to be much more valuable. So here's a recap of those 5 critical steps. Again, every single student, whether you've done this for an ACT, done this for an SAT, to make the most of that experience, please make sure that you go through all of these steps. How does that then bring us to ACT versus SAT? Well, back to the original question, how do I pick for my kid? The answer is, has your child taken a full-length timed past real ACT and a full-length timed past real SAT so that we can compare scores, compare that baseline performance? Sometimes for students, usually for about half of students, there's one test that's just stronger than the other one. So they've done the 2 practice, they know which test is stronger for them, and then that's where they're going to focus. For some other students, their scores are pretty comparable. So what's really beneficial for them is that when they do those 5 behaviors that were just enumerated for you, when they do those 5 behaviors for the ACT and the SAT, they start to notice patterns. So if they recognize, wow, on my ACT, here was my score, it was comparable to my SAT, but I really made the same mistake 6 times. Okay, well, that's going to be easy to address, and then maybe you have more potential to grow your score if you're just missing the same thing that's repeating over and over. Whereas if on the SAT you also had 6 mistakes, but they were in 6 different areas, okay, well, maybe that's going to be harder to improve. Right, so digging into this process of looking at the data, having the student be incredibly intentional with review, that's how you really can make that informed decision about which test is better. And then, of course, the student was very involved in that process, so then the student really owns it too and takes responsibility and also feels more comfortable that the right decision is being made. One quick thing to show you here is after you have taken a timed practice ACT, if you then wanted to do a practice SAT, very important that you know how to compare the scores, right? So we have this full conversion. You can find these online, of course, as well, that basically break down how does the ACT compare to the SAT and what are the percentiles that go with each score. Now, as a quick note, and we will throw something into the chat or into the Q&A for this, we have been overwhelmed with requests from families to host free practice tests. So for a lot of sophomores, a lot of juniors, they're kind of starting this process. They're anxious. They want to be able to do practice tests. So I'm really excited we're going to do this for free for families all across the US. We were very specific about planning these for dates that are opposite what the real test is that's being offered. So for example, this Saturday, we're doing the practice free ACT, and the real SAT is being administered on Saturday. And then a couple weeks later, we're going to host a practice SAT on a day when a real ACT is being administered. So we tried to do that so that there wouldn't be any confusion, because the last thing we would want is a student showing up to our free practice thinking that he or she was taking the real thing. So that's why we picked the dates that we did. And of course, this is a free opportunity for students to be able to take a real past exam. So we actually went through a 1.5-year process with College Board, a 4-month process with ACT to get permission to give real past exams to students. Because again, that authentic experience of using a real past exam is so critical. So be sure to check in the Q&A and in the chat for links to that if you would be interested in signing up. Essentially what would happen is when you sign up, we will send you a link so that you know where to join on the Saturday. We will be hosting with regular time and with extended time, so we'll be able to provide links for both of those. Of course, the day before, we'll send a parent or guardian the PDF of the real past test with printing instructions so that then the students can join us, have a proctored experience that's virtual, and then of course giving students the opportunity to score their exams and go through that process of learning from their mistakes, reviewing each and every question that they missed. Whew, okay, so next on the agenda is to take you through some pie charts that break down exactly what is tested on each test and how frequently. All right, so let's compare and SAT when it comes to English. So when it comes to the English sections, on the ACT it's called English, on the SAT it's called Writing and Language. What these sections actually test you on is identical. You need to learn where to put commas, where to put semicolons, colons, dashes, how to be efficient with your words, to be short, sweet, and to the point, how to avoid redundancy, parallel structure, agreement, apostrophes, etc. So when it comes to the content that students need to review to do well on the ACT English or to do well on the SAT Writing and Language, the content is identical. That being said, even though they're testing you on the same content, they do it with a different amount of frequency. So what I'm showing you right now are these pie charts. I'm going to show you an ACT pie chart breakdown and then an SAT pie chart breakdown. We're basically, because I've been tutoring for these tests for the past 20 plus years, I've been saving real exams during that time. So I went back through all of these real tests, classified every single question by lesson and topic, and then analyzed those data so that we could share this type of information with families so that they would know exactly what is tested and how much. So here's the breakdown for the ACT English. So what I'm going to do again is kind of show you this one for ACT English and then show you the equivalent one for SAT, and then I'll show you a table that compares them to each other. So what you'll notice, hopefully right away, is that if a student does 3 lessons, punctuation, usage and mechanics, and basics but essentials, just those 3 lessons cover over half of the questions that come up on the ACT English. When we switch to the SAT Writing and Language, you'll notice that just usage and mechanics and punctuation cover that over 50% of the questions. So when we have the opportunity to start working with students in 9th grade and 10th grade, well, we can have them put time into really learning some of the concepts that are tested that don't come up as frequently. However, if a mom or a dad of a senior called me today and said, help, we have the ACT or SAT in a month or 2 months, that's where we use this information to say, okay, well, we need your son or daughter to hyper-focus on just these areas that are tested the most frequently. So again, we can use this information to make the studying process much more efficient, or when you have a student who's a little bit younger, we can use this information to space it out over time so that they have the benefit of being able to review and learn everything that's tested. One thing to call out here as well is that the SAT Writing and Language section has questions on figures and tables. This is very confusing for a lot of students. So basically, the way that the 2 tests are structured is that on the ACT, all of the questions that have to do with looking at a figure or looking at a table, all of those questions are isolated into one section, the last section, which the ACT calls the science section. The SAT, instead of having a separate section called science, tests you on that same exact skill of how to interpret a figure, how to interpret a diagram, how to interpret a table and answer questions. And they put those questions peppered throughout the entire exam. So the Writing and Language section of the SAT has figure and table questions. So does the math. So does the reading. So again, when people say, oh, the ACT has science and the SAT doesn't, be careful, because the ACT has a separate section for figures and tables and diagrams, but that skill of needing to know how to read an x-axis and a y-axis and a key to know what you're looking at in that table or in that diagram, okay, well, that skill is actually tested on both exams. And by the way, it's a critical skill for life, right? So it's a good thing that it's tested on both exams. All right, so here is our side-by-side tables, and please know too that I'm going to share the PDF of all my slides with everybody who is here today joining us. So please do not feel like you have to write everything down with some of these numbers and percents and values, because you will have access to all of this that I'm happy to share as with a link to this recording as well. So here's our side-by-side comparison, ACT versus SAT. Again, what are the top 3 most tested areas? How frequently do they occur? And then what is the point value that's associated with doing well in those sections? So that was the English. Now we'll talk about the math. So the math section is the place where we have the biggest difference between ACT and SAT. You'll notice that when it comes to the total number of questions, not a huge difference. ACT has 60, SAT has 58. Now, when it comes to how much time you have, we see a big difference emerge. ACT, you have 60 questions in 60 minutes. SAT, 58 questions in 80 minutes. The main reason that the SAT has to give students more time per question is that the SAT math section is divided into 2 parts, one with a calculator and one without a calculator. The ACT math gives you a calculator the entire time. So again, SAT has to give more time because they also have a section in which students don't get a calculator to solve math problems, which of course takes longer because you have to do everything by hand. When it comes to the math content that a student needs to know to do well on the ACT or the SAT math, the content is the same. Students have to remember rules from algebra, from geometry, from algebra 2, from arithmetic, and then a little bit of trig. That is comparable on both exams. What I will show you in a second, right, is how the frequency is a little bit different. But again, the top 5 most frequently tested math concepts on ACT and SAT are the same. Another difference between ACT and SAT is the format of the questions. So the ACT math section is all multiple choice. Every single question, you fill a bubble A, B, C, D, E. With the SAT math section, both the calculator and the non-calculator math sections are divided into 2 question types. First are the multiple choice, and then come what are called grid-in questions. So grid-in questions, that basically means I don't have answer choices. I'm asked a math question, I have to solve it, and then if I think the answer is 1.5, I have to look at a little grid and write 1.5, and that is my answer to that question. Here is our pie chart breakdown for what is tested and how frequently on the ACT math. You'll notice it's very algebra, geometry heavy, right? We don't have advanced statistics, we don't have advanced calculus. Really what students need to be able to be ready for the ACT math or the SAT math. If they're in an integrated math course, they need to get through the first semester of IM3, of Integrated Math 3. If they're in the more traditional sequence of algebra, geometry, algebra 2, trig, they do need a little bit of trig, so depending on the Algebra 2 course, if you do a little trig at the end, if you learn unit circle, law of sines, law of cosines, you have what you need to be ready for the test. If you haven't learned that little bit of trig yet and it's built into pre-calc, it's usually towards the beginning of pre-calc. So usually after that first semester of pre-calculus, students again have been exposed to all of the math that they need. Now keep in mind that just because they've been exposed to it doesn't mean that they remember all of it. So what's tough about preparing for these math sections is that they have 5 years worth of math content to quiz you on or to test you on in 60 questions or in 58 questions, right? So they have a lot to choose from to pull just for that many questions. So for most students, the most challenging part of getting ready for these math sections is just putting in time to go back and review and learn really, really basic math concepts that they've just kind of forgotten because they haven't seen them for a long time. Now, what we see when we switch to the SAT math, again, the top 5 most frequently tested concepts are the same, both for ACT and for SAT. So when I show you that side-by-side comparison, again, these 5 categories are exactly the same, it's just that they're jumbled a little bit in terms of the order of what's tested and how frequently. So again, when students are preparing for this math section, so much of what they have to do is just be willing to go back and do some review of concepts that they haven't seen for several years. Here's a little bit more of a breakdown for the SAT math, which is confusing for families because again, it has those 2 different sections. So the non-calculator section happens before the calculator section. You'll notice the non-calculator section has 20 questions, 15 multiple choice, followed by 5 grid-in. Those questions have to be answered in 25 minutes. Then what you'll see, what I included for you, are the top 5 most frequently tested concepts in the SAT non-calculator math section. With the calculator section, there are 38 questions, 30 of them are multiple choice, and then 8 of them are gridded. Same thing, those are the top 5 most frequently tested concepts. Now, a huge tip that I can share with you that a lot of students don't know, the way that the SAT structures these sections is that the math gets increases in terms of the level of difficulty. So in the SAT math calculator section, from questions 1 through 30 for the multiple choice, they go from easy to medium to hard. Question 31 through 38, those grid-in questions, restart the level of difficulty and go easy, medium, hard. So if you're a student struggling with question 28, 29, 30 of those hard multiple choice, it's actually advantageous for you to skip them, go to the grid-in, because when you start the grid-in, the level of difficulty resets back to easy. So instead of wasting a lot of time on those really hard last multiple choice questions, you can better utilize that time to then do some grid-ins, where again, then you have that opportunity to use the time more wisely to build some more points, because you can get more questions right if they're easier. And then if you have time, you can go back to those hard ones. Remember, don't leave anything blank on the ACT or SAT, because you're not penalized for guessing. Okay, so next is the reading section. So the ACT reading section is 35 minutes. For 4 passages that have 10 questions each, so that's 40 questions total. The SAT, you're probably looking at this going, oh my gosh, this is a huge difference. The SAT is 65 minutes for the reading. ACT is 35 minutes for the reading. You're probably like, what is going on? That feels so different, right? That's almost double the amount of time. So here's what's happening. As I mentioned to you already, the ACT has that separate section that it calls the science section that happens last, that tests students on figures, tables, diagrams. So what the ACT does is it has a 35-minute section for reading that they call reading. That's all passages, all answering multiple choice questions from passages. Then it has a 35-minute science section that's all answering questions from figures and tables and diagrams about scientific content. So again, what the ACT is doing is taking a 35 and a 35 and kind of separating the skills. One is 100% reading comprehension. The other one has more to do with reading and with figures and tables and diagrams. Add those together, you get 70 minutes. What the SAT does is, instead of separating into 2 shorter sections, the SAT has one longer section called reading that's 65 minutes. However, what you need to know is, in this reading section, there are 5 passages. 2 of them are about science. So they will have a figure or a table or a diagram, and they will be about scientific information. So regardless of which test you take that ends up being stronger for you, you need the same skills and the same content knowledge to be successful on both. It's just that the structure of and the timing and the nature of some of the questions is different. So you do have to do practice for both so that you can figure out which one's stronger for you. But at the end of the day, the content that they want you to know, the skills that they want you to have, are the same. So here's our breakdown of the types of questions that are asked in the ACT reading section. Here's our breakdown of the types of questions asked in the SAT reading section. One quick thing that I want to call out about SAT reading, you'll notice here are those questions about details from figures and tables and diagrams. There's also this special type of question that only comes up on the SAT reading that is stressful for students and where students have the lowest accuracy. So I just want to spend a minute kind of calling your attention to this question type, which is when they ask students to pick evidence to justify prior answers to questions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that pick evidence type of question in a second. Here's our side-by-side comparison of the types of questions that are asked, how frequently, and what is the point value assigned for each one. Here is an example of that pick evidence question. So basically, question number 9 is asking the student to go to line 32, a little before, a little after, answer a question for number 9. And then question number 10 says, which choice provides the best evidence to answer the previous question? So what happens is students sometimes feel a little bit paralyzed when they see these types of questions, because they're sitting there going, oh my gosh, well, if I miss question number 9, I'm going to miss question number 10, right? They feel like there's this double whammy or this kind of double impact to their score. So students have to know to expect these questions. They happen basically 1 out of every 5 questions on the SAT reading is going to ask them to justify their answer to the prior question. And accuracy in these sections can garner a student 50 to 60 points in that evidence-based reading and writing score, which is out of 800 points. So if you have a student who's at a 600 and is trying to get to a 650 and is missing this type of question, the answer for that student is to just drill, you've got to get better at this question type, and then that's exactly how you're going to see that score boost that you're looking for. Okay, I do want to be sensitive to time, so I'll try to wrap up here in the next 5-ish minutes. So then, of course, we'll have time for questions, and I am happy to stay past 4 just to make sure that I can answer all of your questions. Of course, feel free to stay or hop if you need to go, but just want to do a quick acknowledgement that I know that I've been talking here for a long time. Okay, ACT Science. We've already talked about this. We've already talked about how the SAT does not have a separate science section. The SAT has decided to pepper questions about figures and tables throughout the entire test. The ACT, on the other hand, has this separate dedicated section, all with questions about figures and tables and diagrams. Here's a breakdown of the types of questions that are asked in the ACT Science section. Right, you'll notice basically what students have to do is read text, look at tables, look at figures, look at diagrams, and answer questions. Last thing that I want to share with you, what are tips for success on both exams? Number 1, I've talked about this already. Never leave a question blank. Super important, there's no penalty for guessing. So you want to make sure that you never leave anything blank. Even if you're running out of time, always guess, and always guess the same letter. Statistically, students have a better chance of getting questions right if they're always guessing the same letter, versus kind of the tendency to want to make a pretty pattern or something like that with the Scantron bubbles. Don't do that. When you run out of time and you're guessing, we should have a straight column all the way down with the same bubble. Another thing that sounds silly to mention, but a lot of students don't realize this, the booklet that they're using for their practice, the booklet that they're using on the real test, it's theirs, right? They should write all over it. They should underline, they should circle, they should label math figures, whatever they need to do, they should write all over the booklet. And for some reason, students sometimes don't know that and they think they're not allowed to write in it. Totally not the case. It's yours. You do have to turn it in, of course. They don't let you keep it. But while you're there taking the test, you should definitely write all over it. I mentioned this earlier, I'll mention it again. When you are doing time practice, always practice your bubbling with the Scantrons. It takes time, it takes practice, it's an easy place to make mistakes, so you want to make sure that you review that. Last thing to share with you is a little bit of a breakdown. So if we were all together in a room right now, which I wish we were, I would ask all of you, pretend that you're running out of time, pretend that you have to guess, what letter would you guess? Based on my experience doing this with parents and student groups, just in person in the past, pretty much 80 to 90% of people will say that they want to guess C. So I was curious about that. So I went through my stack of 85 real ACTs and SATs, and I looked at the last 10 questions of each section. So the part at the end when students run out of time, and I counted how frequently at the end was the right answer A, the first bubble, B, the second bubble, C, the third bubble, or D, the fourth bubble. Not surprisingly, the least frequent right answer at the end of a test, again, this is just the end. If I analyze the entire exam, we'd have an equal distribution of how many times each answer choice was correct. But if we just look at the end, just look when students run out of time, C is the least frequent right answer, likely because the people writing these tests know that teenagers have a tendency to guess C, and they don't want them to have an unfair advantage if they're always guessing the letter that would actually occur the most frequently. B was the second from the bottom after C in terms of being the least likely right answer. Then came A, and then came D. So if you take nothing else away from this entire presentation, the most important thing to remember is if you run out of time at the end and you have to guess either all the first column, either guess all A, or guess all the last column, all D. Last thing I want to do is give a quick shout out thank you to Zoom that is partnered with Winward Academy so that our webinars can reach hundreds of families around the country. So again, quick thank you to Zoom. And now, of course, I would love to go to all of you, be able to answer any questions that you have. So what I'll do here is go ahead and pull up the Q&A and the chat. Okay, so it looks like we have a question. It says, what SAT, ACT platforms would you recommend that have these diagnostic tools? Well, not to sound a little silly when answering this question, but all of these tools we built incredibly intentionally at Winward Academy because I wanted students to have the same experience, the same analytics that you can provide as a private tutor, but through a platform where you can provide that support and analytics for students to be able to own more of the process, or of course to still have, you know, an adult with a lot of experience with all of these providing that extra support. So I know that we have all of these tools and resources. A lot of private tutors will also, you know, try to provide the same level of analytics and support for students as well. Let me see the next question. It says, I'm concerned about my child doing test prep in a group or through in-person tutoring sessions due to COVID. Very understandable concern. But I don't want her to be at a disadvantage for not getting individualized help. How does Winward Academy customize test prep for the individual student, and what kind of results do you generally see? Okay, so great question, very understandable. A lot of people right now, kind of the traditional ways that they might have looked for support in the past, either they're not comfortable with anymore, they don't even happen anymore. One thing that I can share with you, let me see, I think I might have an extra slide for this. Yes. So we have a lot of different programs that range from being self-directed all the way to being super personalized. And they range in price from $250 to $2,500, right? So there's a huge range there so that we can connect individually with each family and make sure that they're getting what they need, but that they don't have to pay for things that they don't need. So again, some of the more self-directed programs will give students access to practice tests and lessons, where they're able to do those analyses and kind of decide what they need to do, but then they really guide the ship themselves. And then you can work your way up to having programs where we can actually analyze their diagnostics. We can create customized weekly study plans for them. We also have accountability coaches who can check in with students on a weekly basis and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So there are some parents who are like, I'll do that part and save the money if you just make the study plan. There are other parents who are like, oh my gosh, please, will you just check in with my kids so we don't have to talk about it, we don't have to be concerned about it. So of course we want to provide both just because you never know what would be best for a family. Okay, let me go ahead and open up the chat here. Perfect, so it looks like we have lots of links that we've shared. Let's see. Oh my gosh, so when I have done this webinar, I think over the summer, I think we had something like 40 questions in the Q&A. So please, if you have any other questions, please feel free to throw them in here. I can also just keep talking about other things. Let me see if any other questions have come up. I'm currently filling out my college applications and my high school doesn't give a lot of support. Can you help with this? Yes, I actually just got off a call last week with UC Irvine. They have a center that is committed to doing a lot of work in the community in Anaheim and trying to help families with college applications. And the big concern is that college counselors are completely overwhelmed, are just like not even helping students. This is a very, very, very real issue right now, very big concern. So number one, keep in mind that a main place where students struggle with this is just kind of figuring out how to get organized. So trying to understand, you know, what are the deadlines? What do I have to submit in each place? Where do I fill these things out? One thing that I could consider doing too, maybe in a couple weeks or sometimes in the next month, would be to do another webinar just about kind of an overview of that process to help families just kind of know how to get things started. One thing that we have too that a lot of students find helpful is we have a college knowledge curriculum where we have pre-recorded video lessons that show students how to fill out the Common App 1 page at a time, 25 examples of personal statements with discussion around what made them compelling, what made them authentic, like why did the student get accepted with this essay. So if you're just kind of looking for more resources and support around college knowledge, college applications, absolutely feel free to look into the college knowledge curriculum. I also am happy to, I do, you know, consultations with families and just talk with them for usually 15, 20 minutes just to be able to answer some of these questions and help guide them to specific support and specific resources based on their kids' individual needs. So in the follow-up email to all of you, I'm happy to send a little Calendly link to be able to book something like that too, if that would be helpful for you. Okay, let's see. Oh, how much does the Game Changer package cost? All of these questions are about what we offer, which is so nice, but please also feel free to ask questions just generally about ACT, SAT, because I'm happy to answer those too. So to your question, how much does the Game Changer package cost? So we have the Crunch Time bundle, which basically gives students access to the top 25 most frequently tested lessons on ACT and SAT with 6 practice tests of each, all with step-by-step explanations. That bundle's $250. The Game Changer bundle, which has all of the lessons they could ever possibly need for ACT or SAT practice tests for both, that bundle is $500. So it's $499.99, but basically $500. So our hope in kind of developing these programs is that the national average for the cost of a private tutor is $300 an hour. So our hope was, how do we bundle everything that a student needs for less than a family would pay for 1 2-hour session with a private tutor, which is the average time that tutors meet with students, and just wanted to try to find a way that they could have everything that they need and have it be much more economical for families. And again, we do kind of, those are the 2 self-directed programs, and then we also have more personalized programs as well. Okay. Can anyone do the free practice test? Can I share it on Facebook? Absolutely. The free practice tests are available to anybody, anywhere. It's not the typical, like, sign up for a free test, we'll take your credit card. No, it's like totally free, totally just to be supportive and just to help students. So please feel free to share on Facebook or with any of your friends or athletic groups or with anybody whom you think would be able to benefit. If my child plans to take the test in the spring, should I sign up for the test program now? How many weeks does Winward usually take to complete? So that's a great question, and that's another question that you can't answer honestly until a student does a practice of each. The reason is that some students might just need a month. They might be really close to their goal score. They just need to review a couple different content areas, and then boom, they're ready to go. Other students might need 3 months, might need 4 months if they have more of those content areas that they need to address. So I can't answer your question perfectly without looking at the data for your son or daughter. So again, what I would recommend is take advantage of those practice tests. The other thing too to know is that yes, we're offering these timed practice tests, but if you're not free when they're available on those different Saturdays, I'm also more than happy to email you with the PDF of the test and the proctoring instructions. You can self-proctor from home and still sign up for the free trial to be able to score it and review it. So even if you can't join us live, please don't think that you would miss out on the opportunity, because we're still more than happy to support for you to be able to self-proctor that. And again, after that self-proctoring experience and after we can really dig into the data, then we can answer those questions like, how much time do I need to study? How long do you recommend our kids study per day? So this is another really good question, and it is very personal depending on, again, what classes is the student taking, what's realistic that we can have the student do without being totally overwhelming, and how far away is the test. So this is, again, is a great question that I think I could better answer for an individual family after we can actually look at the data for where the student is starting. I'd say on average, like students who are starting programs now and know that they're going to take the test in the spring, they're putting in usually 2 hours per week. When the test is more imminent and we need to kind of kick it up a notch, students are usually putting in closer to 5 to 10 hours a week. If it's during a holiday week and we have even more time that we can kind of build on to what they're doing, we could even kick it up a notch more. One thing to put into perspective of how students study for these exams, so what they do in China, this is wild. They do these boot camps. Well, I guess they used to. I guess they might not be able to do them anymore. But families would pay $10,000. Their kids would go to a boot camp for 10 days. They all live in a hotel. They study for 12 hours a day. They put up these tables in these ballrooms, and kids do 12 hours a day with an instructor in the front, kind of doing all of these practice questions. They get an hour break for video games, and then they have study hall at night, where basically they do these 10-day boot camps where students are putting in usually about 14 to 15 hours a day studying. So after this boot camp, the students have studied 140 or 150 hours for the test, and then they take it the next week. And I always just kind of shake my head, like if I could get a kid to do 150 hours of prep for these tests, that would be amazing, right? But it's hard because we don't necessarily have that same approach, which, you know, we sometimes have to space things out so that we're looking to have more balance, and it doesn't feel like this, you know, crazy test prep experience where we can kind of take a step back and say, look, we want you to learn this information, but not just for this SAT, right? We actually want you to learn this. We want you to use it. We want it to be second nature, so that then when you are a professional and you're sending emails to your professor or to a potential employer, you feel comfortable, you feel confident with the way that you're presenting yourself with your writing skills, right? That's what actually matters. So sometimes, you know, yes, people can do a very intense boot camp style, or we can choose to kind of space things out so that it feels like a more natural learning experience. Do parents have a login to see their kids' progress, or do we need to use their login? So usually what parents do when they want to have some oversight with what their kids are doing is, yes, you can certainly sit with your student and kind of look at, you know, show me what your accuracy is, your pre-lesson accuracy, your post-lesson accuracy, that type of information. But we also have reports that we can run for parents. So we provide support for that as well if parents are just looking for a bit more transparency around what their kids have been doing. Okay, last question. Thank you for this. You are very welcome. How can I stay in the know about future webinars? So since you have signed up for this one, we will keep you or kind of add you to our email list, so you will be able to receive notifications in the future about free practice test opportunities, more free webinar opportunities. So hopefully we'll be able to present about content that would be relevant for you and your family. Also, please keep in mind, I love hearing from families if there's more that we can do. So if there's a specific topic that seems to be a really burning issue, or if there's anything like that that we can do so that we can better support our community and our families, please always feel free to let me know, because I would love to be able to put together presentations that, again, can really dig in and address your questions. Okay, well, thank you again so much for joining today. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. For those of you in San Diego, hopefully the Padres game is going well, our first time in the playoffs in 14 years. So hopefully you can get back to the game if you paused to join us. And again, thank you so much to everyone. And feel free, after I send an email with a little summary of today's presentation, if you have any other questions, feel free to respond to me directly, and I'd be more than happy to help. All right, thank you so much again. Take care, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.